Charles, this is war. We can't beat the Germans by behaving like English gentlemen.
Welcome to the Indiana Jones universe, the podcast that explores the incredible adventures of the world's greatest globe-trotting archaeologist, Indiana Jones. Each episode is a casual and somewhat humorous, opinionated conversation with a slightly sophisticated analytical study of the expanded universe content from the Indiana Jones franchise. You can expect to find discussions about the adventures of young Indiana Jones, the further adventures of Indiana Jones comic books, the Staff of Kings and Emperor's Tomb video games, the Indiana Jones novels, the original soundtracks, and so much more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Indiana Jones Universe podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and today we are extremely excited to announce that we are continuing our interview series for young Indiana Jones. This is something we started back in 2022 to commemorate 30 years of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and as a result, we felt compelled to interview the directors and writers from this series to learn more about what it was like working with George Lucas to create this extraordinary and ambitious television series. We have numerous filmmakers joining us for the next couple of episodes, which is super exciting, so stay tuned for that. Now today, we are thrilled to have an incredibly accomplished screenwriter, novelist, and broadcaster joining the podcast. He began his career with the BBC television, working as a news reporter and producing documentaries. Then during the 1990s, he decided to begin working in film and television, creating screenplays such as The Adventures of Jules Verne, The Mists of Avalon, and so many more. But most notably, he was also responsible for writing 3 terrific episodes of Young Indiana Jones, Barcelona, Prague, and Petrograd, 1917. So with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest today, Mr. Gavin Scott. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Will. It's a delight to be here.
Great to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come chat with me about Young Indiana Jones, an absolutely incredible television series. And let's just start right from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself. How did your film career begin, and how did that ultimately lead to your role on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles?
The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles came at a crucial point in my entire career. I began as a journalist in New Zealand. In fact, my family had emigrated from England to New Zealand in the early 1960s, and that's where I grew up. Well, I first of all grew up for the first 10 years of my life in Yorkshire, in England, in the city of Hull, Kingston upon Hull. Then, as I say, my family emigrated to New Zealand, so I grew up a very different lifestyle from a northern industrial city in the countryside of New Zealand. After high school, in fact, I went off to the jungles of Borneo for a year when I was 17 and taught English to the children of headhunters for a year before going to university. At university, I met my wife, with whom I've recently celebrated our 53rd wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And her mother was a well-known journalist in New Zealand, and she gave me permission to marry her daughter, provided I learnt how to write a leading paragraph and had a basic familiarity with the laws of libel. And so I did a course in journalism simultaneously with my finishing my university degree. And when I'd completed that, I went into broadcasting as a reporter with the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation. This was in the early 1970s in Wellington, New Zealand. And I was a transport correspondent and general reporter, and then I began making radio documentaries. And at that point, after a couple of years, Nicola, my wife, and I decided to head across the world, as most New Zealanders do at some point in their lives. It's called OE, Overseas Experience, and we headed off across Asia, where we spent several months traveling through places you actually can't go to so easily these days. You know, we traveled through Kashmir and Afghanistan and Iran, and in those days, in the 70s, you know, you could just, you know, hop on a bus and go, or hitch rides and go. So we crossed Asia, went to the UK, and I began once again to pursue my trade as a journalist with Times newspapers, the Times educational supplement, and became an education reporter. I concentrated on newspapers for the first couple of years, but my heart had always been in broadcasting. So I managed to get work in BBC Radio and with two programs, The World at One and PM programs, news and current affairs, which are still going to this day. And for 5 years, I was a radio reporter for the BBC. Then I graduated or moved across to BBC Television, a program called Newsnight. And I also made documentaries for the BBC as well, and then for commercial television. So basically for 20 years of my professional career, I was a journalist. But I also began writing novels during this time. The first one was a thriller set in New Zealand called Hot Pursuit, about a Soviet satellite crashing in the New Zealand forests. And I found when I was making documentaries for television, I loved filmmaking. So I thought, is there a way to combine my pleasure in filmmaking and my pleasure in writing fiction by writing screenplays? So I basically began teaching myself to write screenplays, which I did initially by getting hold of a book by William Goldman, who wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And that was published as a paperback, not in the right format, but I suddenly realized you didn't have to say what lenses the cameraman should use and what lights they should use. You could just write basically a story and dialogue and as much exciting stuff as you could. So that got me writing screenplays, just on spec, as one does. I actually managed to sell some options on one about Jules Verne that I wrote in the usual fashion of these things. Nearly got made. In fact, I had some wonderful interactions with the director Richard Lester, who made the Superman movies, and he nearly made it. But that's showbiz. But bottom line was, after doing this for 2 or 3 years, I felt, okay, I'm beginning to understand this business, and it was coming up to my 20th year as a journalist, and I felt, and for me, to the age of 40, I felt, I need to make a distinctive change here. I could go on being a journalist who writes screenplays in his spare time, or I can go in boots and all, resign from my job in television and say, I am now a screenwriter. Now, by this time, I'd got an agent in London, a wonderful woman called Linda Seifert, and I went to see her and told her of my plans, and she looked a bit green about the gills. Because I pointed out that, from now on, what I earned through her would be supporting my wife, my 3 children, my mortgage, the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I said, well, is anything going on? Is there anything, coming up that I could be hopeful about? And she said, well, George Lucas is coming to London to recruit writers for a television series he's doing called The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. And I said, whoa. That sounds fascinating. She said there'll be a great emphasis on history. I know you're very interested in history, which I was and am. And I said, great, what have you sent him? And she said, well, I've sent him your resume. I said, well, Linda, that's not going to make a great impression because I haven't had anything produced. Send him a script. And she said, well, no, they've specifically said they do not want to see scripts. Now, 24 hours before, I would have accepted. Those were the rules. But I had really been in to see my boss at TV News, and I had really resigned. And so this was entirely real to me. So I said to her, okay, I want you to ignore that instruction and send them a script because I think that's the only way I'll get an interview. She sent the script in, and I got the message back saying, come and meet George Lucas and producer Rick McCallum. So that's how it began.
Wow, that's terrific. And speaking of which, before production began, what were your initial conversations like with George Lucas and Rick McCallum, and how well did your creative vision align with their ideas?
Well, you ask a good question there, because that, I think, was the other key moment. So they knew about the Jules Verne. The Jules Verne script, you see, it was almost like the reverse of the Young Indy concept. Young Indy was taking a fictional character and putting him into real historical situations. That's what George wanted for the series. And what I'd done with Jules Verne was I'd taken the real Jules Verne and put him into fictionalized versions of his novels. So that was where I was coming from. But I did the research on Indiana Jones and thought about it. And I noted that the initial movies were set in the 1930s, that Harrison Ford, the character, seemed to be in his 30s in the movies. So I thought, when would he have been born? Let's assume around 1900. I also knew that the show featured a 10-year-old young Indy and an 18-year-old young Indy. And I wondered to myself what had inspired the 10-year-old young Indy to decide he wanted to be an archaeologist. We knew his father was an archaeologist, but had there been something extra? And I then looked back into who he might have met in 1910, who might have inspired him. And I was already familiar with the story of Thomas Edward Lawrence, who later became Lawrence of Arabia. And when I looked more closely into it, I saw that around that time, of course, he wasn't Lawrence of Arabia then, in 1910, he was a young archaeologist working in the Middle East. And what if, I thought, young Indy had gone there with his father and had met the young T. Lawrence? What an inspiration. And so I put this proposal to George, who was intrigued, and said, yes, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that. And we talked for a while, as they do. He said, well, don't call us, we'll call you, so to speak.
Right.
And then I had my leaving party from ITN, Independent Television News, where I was then working, and went off with my family to a little cottage in the Dordogne area of France, where about 10 days later, the phone rang and a voice said, how soon can you get over to Skywalker Ranch?
Wow.
So I heaved a great sigh of relief, as you can imagine. And a couple of weeks later, find myself in an office with a bunch of other wonderful writers and George Lucas in that incredible place, Skywalker Ranch.
Wow, that's incredible. And the idea that, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia would meet Indy, I always thought that was something George had kind of knew immediately when he started the series. And the fact that you were able to contribute that is just a testament to what he saw in you and all the other writers. And speaking of that, for this television series, George Lucas decided to do something somewhat unconventional and hire multiple different screenwriters and have everyone work collaboratively to create the episodes, and then he would assign episodes to different people. So take us through the entire screenwriting process from start to finish. What was this unique experience like?
It was fantastic. I mean, from the word go, it was delightful. From the moment of arriving at San Francisco airport and being driven across the Golden Gate Bridge through beautiful Marin County and along those wonderful golden hills to Skywalker Ranch, and being put up in this gorgeous building. The ranch has buildings in different styles, but the one the writers were staying in was Victorian style, so it was like being in something from the late 19th century. And then we went up to the main house every day to sit down with George. I should mention that in each of our rooms, I think there were 5 of us, or perhaps 6, including me. It varied slightly, but basically like half a dozen of us in the writer's house, and then half a dozen of us would go up to the main house. And with us, we would take the material we'd been given the night before, which was a thick package of research material, notebooks, all sorts of things, because George had, when Paramount Pictures, my understanding is this, that when Paramount Pictures were shutting down their research department,
wow,
terrible thing to do, going to scatter all their materials, George, as he has so often done with the industry, making a contribution to the industry as a whole, bought up all the research library and hired the research librarians.
Oh, wow.
And took them up to Skywalker Ranch, where they were housed in a gorgeous 2-story room with a sort of minstrel's gallery around and full of every kind of research item you could want. And each day they produced for us a package to cover the historical area of the next episode. So we would read those overnight, and we would turn up about 9 a.m, as I recall, in George's office for tea or coffee. George has a lovely office overlooking the lake and in the middle of the house. It's not his living house, but it's I think it's a reproduction of his real house, but on a huge scale. And we would sit in very comfortable chairs, and then essentially what would happen is we would brainstorm, and he would say, "Okay, this is the premise of this episode. Has anyone got any basic ideas?" And we'd just discuss it for a little while in general, and then we'd say, "Okay, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4." We did it act by act, possibly an opening scene as well. But essentially, that's what we did. Each person in the room threw their ideas into the pot for the first scene in the movie. And it was brainstorming. Not everyone understands the concept of brainstorming. Some people think, there were even people there sometimes who thought that the idea was to listen to what another writer had to say and then say, that's not going to work. But George understood brainstorming very well, which was never to shoot anybody's idea down. He took the notes. he never criticized anyone. He took the notes, and about every half hour, he'd just sum up where the discussion had gone. And all the ideas that he didn't like had slipped away.
Right.
And the ideas that he did were there. But nobody's feelings were hurt. It was brilliant. He was a brilliant manager of the brainstorming of the creative process of six big egos around a room. Obviously, he was coming up with ideas as well. We were bouncing ideas off. It wasn't just us, but we were all throwing our ideas in, and gradually it was building. So that's the way it worked.
Wow, that's fascinating to learn a little bit more about that process. And you mentioned the research team, which I want to talk about a little bit as well, because each episode is almost like a separate feature film. It deals with its own complex historical event, and it changes the tone and pace of each episode. So how closely did you work with the research team to bring this historical fiction series to life?
Well, the research team provided us with the raw material. The research department people, Jane in particular, used to sit in on the meeting. So if there were any questions that arose during our discussions as to whether something was historically possible or whether something extra could be added, they were there to answer that question, or the question would go down to the research department library and be answered pretty quickly. Because I'm an enthusiast for history myself, I was occasionally able to add things that people didn't know and add a little extra perspective, but that just all added to the fun of it. That was good. And also, I just loved all the reading. I loved the stuff they'd provided us with. The main evolution, I would say, of the way that the creative process worked in the course of those individual meetings was that we usually found, in practical terms, that by lunchtime we had got a couple of acts outlined to everyone's satisfaction. And then we would go and have one of the excellent lunches that the ranch provided, wonderful, wonderful cooks, and usually kind of a little stroll around the lake or something. And then we'd reconvene in the afternoon. And here's what we not nearly always, but very often found, was that at the end of Act 3, we had another act to do, and we'd get a bit stuck. And there were two ways that George dealt with this. One was that he would call down to see if there were any chocolate cookies available to fuel further discussions. But the other genius thing that he did was he would say, all right, what do we want to have achieved by the end of the show? What do we want Indy to have learned? What do we want to have happened to the bad guy? What what point in the historical situation do we want to leave it? Etc. The heroine, what are those objectives that we have to do? And then he would work backwards. But by that time, of course, we only had one act to do, you see. So we'd now got 3 acts of sufficiently complicated stuff going on. And we didn't know how to get from there to the end. But now we know what the end goal was. We just had to fill in the relatively small steps that were needed to get from Y to Z, so to speak. And I thought that was brilliant. It cut through the brain fog that you sometimes get at the end of a day's brainstorming. And it meant that at the end of the day, we had the outline for a new episode. We were ready to go back, read the research material for the next day, and come back and do it all again.
Well, that's such a collaborative process. And I love the way that George Lucas thinks about things. He's quite a visionary in that way, where he just does things on his own sort of accord, and always has a creative way to look at problems and find solutions in that way. Now, in terms of actually creating the screenplays yourself, what do you think are the most fundamental elements of any good screenplay, and how did you adapt that method for young Indy?
Well, I always start with a story. I mean, I love to have a good story to tell. The characters are important, but because we had Indiana Jones created by George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, I didn't have to think, well, who should we put in this? And also we had the historical characters as well. So that meant we didn't have to start off by thinking, who should these characters be? That we could take for granted. And essentially, and here's the other interesting constraint, which was George was determined that these stories be historically accurate. That is to say, we were telling a fictional story, but it was within the context of what had really happened, because he wanted kids to come away from this show knowing more than they did before. They wanted to entertain people, but he definitely wanted to educate as well, because he felt that American schools did not give enough importance to understanding history. And I really admire him for that, admire him for that. So what I take personal delight in is taking a complex mass of facts and finding the dramatic moments within them, the hinge points within them, where suddenly the complexities fall away and the character is faced with a dilemma or a threat, or it could be different things, or a choice. But essentially, he or she is put into a situation where they have to say, "This is what I'm going to do." So it was that dramatization, that creating the hinge points, and then creating a satisfactory resolution, as I say, out of real historic events. So that was how I approached it then. That is really how I approach things now.
Terrific. Yeah, that's great to hear a little bit more about that. And as a writer, do you ever put a little bit of yourself into your characters?
I think so. I think so. I mean, in the case of young Indy, it was different because these were George's characters. But having said that, I suppose some of the idealism of youth and the delight in archaeology and history, they're in me anyway. So yeah, within that context, there's quite a bit of me in my recreations of the past.
So let's start talking a little bit about some of your episodes in more detail. And I'd like to start with Barcelona, 1917, also known as the first part of Espionage Escapades. And from my understanding, you became great friends with the director of this episode, Terry Jones. What was your experience like working with him to create this episode?
It was wonderful. The process started with a phone call from George saying I was back in London, because it's probably worth mentioning that at the end of the brainstorming sessions were then written up as outlines. The outlines were then, at the end of, say, 2 or 3 weeks, it varied over the years we were working on it, but at end of 2 or 3 weeks, they were then assigned, and then we all went home to write our episodes, and we reconvened, sometimes at Skywalker Ranch, sometimes in London, to collectively edit the scripts. It's probably worth adding that little detail in. So I'd written Barcelona, and I was back in London, and George called me and said, "Gavin, there's a director I would like to do this, Terry Jones of Monty Python, who directed Holy Grail and Life of Brian and so on, and he won't do it. Will you go and persuade him?"
Oh my
God. George Lucas can't persuade him, and me, who's been in the industry for a couple of months. But Terry, so I called him up and said, "Can I come and see you?" Which I thought that's quite a task to undertake, but Terry very graciously invited me round. And he explained the reason he'd said no was because he had a script that he'd written some years ago, which he'd set aside the next 3 months to rewrite. Now, under normal circumstances, I'd have said, "Well, yeah, I understand." But in this case, George Lucas had asked me to get him, and I was not going to let George down. So I said, "Well, would you like me to rewrite it for you, Terry?" Which is a bit cheeky, but
wow.
And he looked at me rather surprised. He said, "Well, you want to have a go?" So I took his script away and rewrote it for him, and I think he was, and then, I did this in 10 days. And when I sent it back to him, I think of course, what I hadn't really thought through this is put him in rather an embarrassed position. Just done this wrong. He happily, he did like what I'd done. And we went on to become writing partners, but it meant that he no longer had his excuse. So he agreed to do it. And that was the beginning of a wonderful experience.
That's great. And he also played one of the characters in this episode, Marcello. Did you work with him to create that character at all?
Well, yes, I suppose I did, in the sense that, yes, he decided to play that character, and therefore the lines were modified to suit him. People who look carefully at the film will also see me there.
Yes.
Just in a little bit role, but it was fun. But we all flew out to Prague. We shot in Prague and Barcelona because the theatre scenes were shot in Prague. It was just the most wonderful experience. I mean, everybody had huge amounts of fun. I always remember there was one point where we were getting ready and we weren't shooting yet, and Terry and I went out for a drink in one of those wonderful semi-underground, well, they're sort of huge cellars where they've got pubs in Prague. And we were leaning at the bar having a drink, and I glanced along, and there was Václav Havel, the president of the Czech Republic, with the president of Mexico, of all people,
Oh, wow.
who was visiting, and they were having a drink together at the bar. And I thought, this is pretty cool. I'm here having a beer with Terry Jones of Monty Python, and just yards away from the president of Czechoslovakia and the president of Mexico. And it was amazing. And here's the thing, the fantastic detail that went into this. I mean, in the theatre scenes, the theatre is full of people. They weren't CGI people. Each of them was costumed in the evening dress of 17, I think it was. No expense was spared, and enormous economy was made. These incredible shows were made for $1.5 million.
Oh, wow.
I mean, hats off to George and to Rick McCallum, who did a fantastic job in making money go a long way, because all the money's on the screen. They look fabulous, and yet they were not multi-million-dollar productions, although they looked like it.
Totally. Absolutely. And speaking of which, there's that little scene where you, of course, had a little acting role as a German spy. So did you have any other behind-the-scenes stories to share about shooting on location for this episode and actually being on the set?
Yes. Oh, it was a great experience. I mean, one of my strongest memories is the scene in the bull ring where the duel is about to take place, and Terry has got to drive that huge and beautiful car, smash through into the bull ring in time. And I mean, that's a pretty exciting moment. It's a real bull ring. You could still smell the blood in the sand.
Oh, wow.
You really could. It had, just been used the day before for a bullfight. So it was the real deal. And that was exhilarating. I mean, the scenes in the theater of the ballet were, hilarious. Poor young Indy, dressed in that costume. I remember that I had written in the script that he had to gyrate so as to make the light shine off the jewels on his costume to pass the message along. And I remember being told afterwards that standards and practices at the network had said, this is permissible, provided he does not gyrate in a suggestive way.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's wonderful.
That's great.
Another thing that's worth mentioning, that the second unit cameraman on that show was none other than a certain George Lucas.
Oh, wow.
Because we had so many wonderful old cars, and as you know, he has a great love of old cars, he came along to shoot them himself and did. But somebody called him while he was having a shower at his hotel. He stepped out to grab the phone and broke his arm.
Oh.
So there was oh my gosh, the creator of the show and the key man is now injured, but he, being George, got plastered up, got the camera on his shoulder again, and continued to work.
Wow, that's so interesting, because there's a couple behind-the-scenes photos of like the behind-the-scenes production of Young Indy, and he has a cast on, and I've never known why that is, and wow, that's really interesting.
That's why it is. A piece of advice there: if you hear the phone ringing and you're in the shower, let it ring.
Not in the case of Indy and Prague episode, right? But
well, that's true. That's true. But no, it was an altogether delightful experience in two beautiful cities. Terry Jones is a delightful man, enormous fun to work for. And because he is kind of a comedy legend, he was able to get all sorts of people, actors like Timothy Spall and so on, to join in. And so we had a great cast, two beautiful cities, and everybody had a ball, really. It was enormous fun.
And yeah, the trio of spies in this episode, Marcello, Terry Jones, Cunningham as Timothy Spall, and then Charles, they're such fantastic characters. They add to the comedic spirit of the episode so well. However, with this series, being so heavily focused on Indy, as a writer, how do you try to get the audience invested in these other characters?
Essentially by making them as entertaining as possible. I mean, that's the essence of it. If you've got villains, you've got to make them as villain as possible. But in this case, I wanted to make them as funny as possible, because I mean, if you've got Terry Jones directing and people like Timothy Spall and so on, then you want to make them as fun. Because you're not trying to invest the audience in those characters in the sense of your audience will be lying awake at night wondering what's going to happen to them. One does want the audience to care about young Indy, but essentially you want them to be entertained by the other character. So that was where I was going with that.
And Indy also meets several historical figures in this episode, including Sergei Diaghilev, who was played by William Hootkins, who was in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and also Pablo Picasso, who he meets in another episode. And both of the actors were absolutely phenomenal and really brought these characters to life. In what ways did you want to try to portray these sort of eccentric personalities of these historical figures?
Truthfully is the essence of it, and that was where the fact that the actors were certainly larger than life, which was wonderful, but the original characters were larger than life, and how wonderful to see Pablo Picasso as the designer of sets for ballet, how wonderful to see Diaghilev not in Russia but in Spain, and having to deal with Picasso. So the great thing was, apart from the tone of saying, okay, this is going to be larger than life, as I say, all I had to do was say what actually went on. What was Picasso doing? How did he feel about Diaghilev? How did Diaghilev feel about Picasso? What about the women in the case? Once you get into the details of what happened in history, as a writer, you can just run with it. You know what I mean? I love that. I love the fact that instead of, can we make something up here which will be shocking? No, you don't need to. It happened. Just look at what really went on and, what these people were really like and let them run with it. And so it's not so much that it was easy, but the material that was there to work with.
Right. And we spoke to Matthew Jacobs a couple of years ago as well, another one of the writers, and he said that as well. Like, it was almost like a treasure chest, just, finding all of this historical information, trying to pair Indy with all these historical figures. Now, you talked a little bit about the opening night performance of Scheherazade, such an elaborate and exciting sequence. And I think what's so successful about it is that Indy and Nadia are, physically removed from all the espionage happening behind the scenes. So they have to invent, all of these comedic ways to communicate with everybody in the audience. In this episode in particular, how did you try to balance the amount of espionage and comedy in this episode, making it hilarious to the viewers, but also still kind of emphasizing the historical situation?
My attitude was that the espionage was the excuse, really. I'll be honest with you. It wasn't where eagles dare, where you say, well, will the D-Day landings be able to take place? Yeah. In all honesty, what they were spying about was secondary to the adventure. If you have the opportunity of working with the man who directed Life of Brian and Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you say, let's make this as funny as possible. George was very smart in saying he wanted to get real movie directors to direct these as opposed to people who just, rotated in and out of TV shows. But once he had done that, once he'd made the decision to bring in real movie directors, distinguished movie directors, then he could pick and choose the kind of show he wanted to make, depending on the kind of director that he wanted. So, you had people like Simon Windsor and so on for a different kind of show. But when he read the script that I'd done for Barcelona, he said, I want the best comedy director around. Actually, you've raised a point in my mind which I hadn't really thought of before, which was that how was it that was a comedy episode? How was it written as why was it written as a comedy episode? And I think back that must have happened in that room when during the process I was describing earlier on, because I'm not sure that I genuinely can't remember at this point, and I think I can say it's unlikely that at the beginning of the day George said, okay, we want a comedy here. I think he set up the espionage situation, and as we brainstormed it back and forward and realized that young Indy was going to be involved with Diaghilev and Pablo Picasso and so on, and that the espionage issues were not gigantic. I think we all began to look at the absurd aspects of the situation, and by the end of the day in creating the show, we realized that we had a comedic show. We'd made each other laugh. Now, I won't swear to that. It could be that George planned it as a comedy all along, but I've got a suspicion that we started it out as an espionage thing in the room on the brainstorming day, and by the end of the day, we realized it should be a comedy. That's what I think. Someone may contradict me, and that's fine, but I think that's how it came about. And then, of course, once it was comedically written, then he got the best comedy director around, and you're off to the races.
That's so interesting, because as I was watching this episode in preparation for the interview today, I was thinking about that, like, was this something that George had said initially, I want this to be a comedy episode, but instead, like you were saying, things sort of become a totally different subject or a totally different tone once you have so many different writers contributing all these ideas, and then finally tailoring that episode to a specific director. That's a really fascinating way to look at it. Now, the final duel in this episode between the Count of Toledo and Colonel Schmidt is, quite a comedic ending to a somewhat suspenseful situation. And Cunningham even says to Indy, you may have thought that all of this was for nothing, but it's a jolly good effort, And so this kind of idea that, it kind of is just one great cycle of kind of this espionage in World War I. So what do you think makes a good ending, and should it always be satisfactory?
Well, the answer to should it always be satisfactory is yes, but the satisfaction can be achieved in different ways. Sometimes it's the satisfaction of, we won. The bad guys are knocked out, the good guys have won. That's one kind of satisfaction. Another is a kind of bittersweet satisfaction, is we won, but at what cost, that kind of thing. Another kind of ending is that we lost, but I learned something. Another kind of ending which can give great satisfaction is, I fell in love with that girl. The romance was intense. It was one of the great experiences of my life. I lost her and I learned something. There are different kinds of satisfaction you can provide at the end. And, the story, that's partly what makes storytelling so interesting.
Let's move on now to Prague, 1917, which is the second part of Espionage Escapades. In this episode, Indy spends countless hours attempting to get a new telephone installed. And my first question here is, was this episode meant to be a sort of farcical commentary on the outrageous bureaucratic situation in Europe during World War I?
Yes, but I think the key word is Franz Kafka, whose work embodies loathing of bureaucracy. And I'm sure he was inspired by the bureaucracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But essentially, the key to this episode was Franz Kafka. The very word Kafkaesque for his battles with the bureaucracy, that was our starting point in our brainstorming, and the rest came from that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, too. And it's interesting that Franz Kafka is in this episode, too, because I believe he worked for an insurance company during his life. So that was a real thing, of course, that was incorporated into the episode. Now, I'm curious, if you were responsible for inventing Indy's alias in this episode, Amadeus Schubelgruber, and if so, where did your inspiration for such a ridiculous name come from?
That's a good question in the sense that that's where the fact that it was a writer's room. I'm sure that a lot of us, we came up with that together, but it has a ring of George about it.
It does.
I can imagine George grinning and coming up with Amadeus Schubelgruber. It actually reminds me that there was a point where during World War II where part of British propaganda was that Adolf Hitler's real name was not Hitler, but Schickelgruber.
Oh.
Now, Gruber in German means digger, and a Schickel, a kind of drain down leading from a lavatory. so sewage digger was that Schickelgruber, which what the British said was Adolf Hitler's real name. They said all sorts of things about him. And I suspect that George may have read that and thought Schubelgruber might be a nice variation on that. Of course, Amadeus Wolfgang Mozart was also in Prague and came from Austria, but he spent time in Prague writing Don Giovanni. And that may have put the name in our minds as well. I won't necessarily ascribe it to George, but I have my suspicions.
Now, when Indy goes to the Ministry of Telephones, he is repeatedly told, don't forget your form. But then he immediately loses his form after it blows out the window. What were you trying to symbolize with this particular concept?
Well, oddly enough, this is the truth. One of the things about the Austro-Hungarian Empire was that it was hidebound to the most extraordinary degree. It was two empires. I mean, the Austrian Empire was very old, going back to the deep in the Middle Ages. It had connected itself to the Hungarian Empire through marriage, but it meant that every form had to be in two different languages, and then, of course, in triplicate if you're a bureaucrat, and it was a truly hidebound empire, and of course that's one of the reasons that World War I happened, because there was an assassination, as we all know, of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which need not have led to World War I, but for the fact that it took so long to get anybody to do anything in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including mobilizing the troops and getting them to the right place. They basically got themselves a blank check from the Germans. The problem that they had was that they believed the Serbians had killed the Archduke, which was sort of true, although it wasn't the official Serbian, it was an organization of Serbians. If they punished the Serbians for doing it, the Russians, who were the Serbs' allies, would come in and attack them. So they did a deal with the German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm, whereby he promised to hold the Russians at bay until the Austrians had beaten the Serbians. But the problem was the Austrians took so long to do anything that by the time the ultimatum ran out, the Austrians still hadn't dealt with the Serbs. And essentially that's how World War I began. So in some ways, this Kafkaesque situation, the bureaucracy, the craziness that we depict in the show, it is, as you imply, a fundamental historical fact that led to World War I, which led to World War II, which led to the Cold War, which led to where we are today.
Yeah.
So that's why that form blows out the window.
Right. That's really interesting, too, to consider, the amount of detail and research that went into those historical events to make sure they were so accurately depicted and the theme came across to the viewers. Now, when Indy goes to the Ministry of Police, and we were talking about Kafka a little bit earlier, right, he gets interrogated, sent to court, and then put in jail for an unidentified crime. He has no idea what he's done. Was this a reference to The Trial by Franz Kafka, one of his novels?
Totally, you're absolutely on the money there. Yes, this was the George Lucas version of The Trial. Yes. I mean, we restrained ourselves from having young Indy wake up in bed as a giant cockroach, as in another of Kafka's novels. But yes, this is George's homage to Kafka.
That's great. Now, there's one scene in this episode, actually, when Indy meets Franz Kafka in his office for the first time. That's probably become one of the more iconic moments in the entire series. I'd like to listen to the audio from this scene because it's just absolutely hilarious. So let's take a listen to this short scene here.
This is absolutely ridiculous. All I want is a new phone. I went to the Ministry of Phones, and my form blew out the window. And then I went out on the ledge, and a pigeon knocked it into the street. And then a man stepped on it. And then I had to chase after a tram. And then a woman hit me with her handbag. And so I went to the police. They made me fill it out in German. And then they gave me the 3rd degree. And then they put me in jail.
What you're trying to say is you're upset.
No, I'm not upset. I'm incandescent with rage. What if I took your telephone? Huh? What if I steal your telephone? Then you'd have to go through everything that I've gone through to get it back, and you'd go insane!
It stands up quite well, doesn't it? I'm quite happy with that. Yes.
So I'm curious, could you tell us a little bit about your inspiration for this scene and why you decided to include it?
It's very interesting. I keep a diary, and I was looking back at my diaries for the first months my wife and I were in London in 1973. And we'd got an apartment, we'd bought a flat, and we needed a telephone. It took 6 months to get British without a phone. So you'd imagine what it's like. And this was just standard in those days. It wasn't like, something's gone wrong, or you filled in the wrong form. No, you got it in 6 months. Oh, pretty good going. So yeah. I think that phrase, you asked me if I'm angry. No, I'm not angry. I'm incandescent with rage. I've got a feeling I said that once to someone from the British Telephone Company, or the post office as it then was. I think that in those, yes, it is indicative of the slowness of it, that, as I recall rightly, the people who installed and ran the telephone system were the post office, whose specialty is taking envelopes with bits of paper in them and taking them out of boxes, red metal boxes. The electronics was not where their strong point was. So yes, there's a lot of heartfelt emotion in that.
Certainly. And, one of the most climactic and hysterical moments directly after this is when Indy and Kafka move this filing cabinet down several flights of stairs. And so you mentioned you were on the set with Terry Jones. Was that the case for this episode? And did you have any specific instructions for the director about how you wanted this scene to be filmed?
We talked about how we wanted it to be filmed, and the inspiration there was essentially Laurel and Hardy and the great piano scene in
yes.
Remember the which still, by the way, if ever you're in LA and want to visit a movie landmark, the flight of steps up which they had to get the piano is still there.
Oh, wow.
So yes, I think it's called piano steps these days, named after that. But yes, so that was the inspiration. I remember discussing that with the director, and that was a perfect example of the wonderful opportunities that George provided for us. There, we could do the kind of techniques of a silent movie.
Totally,
we could do some of the things that had been done in 1915. Interesting when you think about it. Of course, that the film techniques that I'm talking about are the film techniques that would have been used during the time when these events were supposedly happening, during the war. It's an amazing thought. It actually literally hadn't occurred to me. But yeah, that was the way they did it back in the days of Laurel and Hardy and Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, those are such iconic films, and you totally get that sense of inspiration, I think, when you watch that scene. And throughout the entire episode, Indy's ability to have a telephone installed is, of course, never ending. And of course, the irony of the final scene is that he finds out that his next assignment is to install another telephone.
Quite.
So, therefore, what theme did you want the audience to take away from this episode?
You could never fight City Hall,
right?
No. I mean, we all have that, don't we? These days, of course, you don't fight with the post office, or you fight with your computer, don't you? Your internet provider, the person for whom you're trying to make up a password. No, it must have 7 letters, 1 special character, No, it's again, that thought has just occurred to me that all this, I'm sure we today have the same level of frustration as I had in the 70s, or young Indy had in the early 1900s, with our super modern communication systems and bureaucratic systems. They've just taken a different form, but the same element of frustration and attention to detail is still there.
Yeah. Now, for the DVD release, both of these sort of comedic episodes, Barcelona and Prague, got paired together into a film called Espionage Escapades. What was your initial reaction when you found out that these 2 episodes got paired together? Because that wasn't the case for all of the other writers having their episodes kind of paired together.
No, I was quite flattered, and I thought, yeah, that's rather fun, actually, isn't it? And there's another Monty Python connection there, in the sense that the director of this was also, he had worked with John Cleese on a film called Fierce Creatures. So there was a link there as well. The Monty Python link continued.
Let's move on to Petrograd, 1917, also known as the second part of Adventures in the Secret Service. What is so intriguing to me about this episode is this sort of dichotomy of Indy working at the French embassy while simultaneously befriending a group of Bolshevik revolutionaries. Why was this idea so compelling to you, and what was your sort of initial vision for this episode?
It was the fact that things were not as straightforward as they seemed at the time of the Russian Revolution. I mean, a lot of people remember the Russian Revolution, or if you ask many people what happened in the Russian Revolution, well, the communists rose up with the people and killed the Tsar and took over Russia. And that, of course, is not what happened at all. As a result of the disasters of the conduct of the war, the sheer inefficiency of the Russian Empire in conducting its own troops in World War One, which matched that of their enemies, the Austrians. I mentioned the inefficiency of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Russian Empire was even more inefficient. But essentially, they blew it. The Tsar destroyed all faith in the Tsar as the father of his people, and the people arose and essentially overthrew the Tsar. And then the Bolsheviks came in, the communists came in and took advantage of that power vacuum. So not many people realize that. They think it was the communists who overthrew the Tsar, and they shot the Tsar, but they didn't overthrow the Tsar. And I wanted to convey some of the complexity. I mean, the other thing about the French, of course, is that the French played a major role in the fact that World War I broke out at all, because they encouraged the Russians to be belligerent in a way that they shouldn't have done. They should have realized that Russia was not capable of taking on Germany and winning. And but for their own reasons, they encouraged the Russians to take a stance which led to the conflict with Germany and as I say, all the consequences that followed.
Yeah, and I like how this episode also enforces the idea of, kind of talking about the first revolution in July, which a lot of people mistake for the October Revolution. And that's sort of enforced in the old Indy bookend a little bit. But there's a scene at the Bear Pit Tavern. It's absolutely superb. And one of the great aspects of this episode is sort of the relationship between Indy and his fellow companions. And you can tell that they all have so much fun together. Why did you think it was important to create this authentic sense of camaraderie given the tense political situation that was occurring in Russia at the time?
Partly because I wanted to emphasize the youthfulness of the revolutionaries. That this was a time of hope. This was a time of the young people seeing the world could be a better place. Now, as we sadly know, older people like Lenin and Stalin came in, and much more cynical people came in and took over. But what I wanted to kind of recreate was that belief. It was almost the situation that we had in 1968 when I was 18 and remembered the youthful idealism of the May of 1968 when young people rose up all over the world to say, the old order is not doing it right. We want a better world. And it was that I was trying to recreate in because I believed that was probably the way they felt back in 1917.
Yeah, that's terrific. And there's a great quote, actually, that one of the characters, Dmitri, says. He says to Rosa, H.G. Wells, Bernard Shaw, our own Maxim Gorky, all these writers think they know how to create a paradise on earth like they can in their books. It's not possible. And then she says, anything is possible now. The Tsar is gone. We decide what happens next. A great kind of example of that, for sure.
Well, I was just going to say also, I like to think that speech is an example of hopes dashed in a way. You know what I mean? Because I was writing this quite a long time after 1968. I remembered our hopes and dreams in 1968 when we believed anything was possible, and it turned out that it wasn't. I think we did make some progress, but it wasn't all that we had hoped. So I wanted that feeling of not melancholy, but that feeling of the sincerity and the reality of those young people's hopes to be real to the audience. So that instead of just thinking this is a disaster in the making, they would feel, a bright new world could be just around the corner, even if it doesn't come.
Yeah, that idealistic vision is totally contrasted with the realism in this episode, which works so well. And let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Indy and Rosa. There's an incredible sequence when they walk across the bridges of St. Petersburg together, and it sort of becomes obvious that Rosa has feelings for Indy. However, later in the episode, Rosa finds out that Indy doesn't feel the same way. So what statement did you want to make in this episode about complex romantic relationships?
Well, sometimes they don't work out. Sometimes you could be in love with someone and they are not in love with you. Or sometimes you could be in love with someone and you fall out of love, or they fall out of love with you. I mean, as we know, this is the human condition. Again, these are the wonderful opportunities that George was giving us. In most movies or TV shows, you almost are obliged, if you start a romance, you've got to bring it to what we spoke of earlier, a satisfactory conclusion. Boy gets girl. And George gave us the opportunity not to have to do that. I mean, in some ways, obviously, it's built into the situation because we couldn't marry young Indy off. But it meant that we could play with the romance of romance that doesn't work out, romance that, could have gone somewhere and doesn't. And you often don't. You rarely get to explore that because in film and television, because you've got to give the audience the satisfaction of, okay, that has been resolved in a satisfactory way. And if it's a standalone thing, it is. But in this case, of course, you could resolve it to go back to what I said earlier, in a satisfactory way, and you get the bittersweet satisfaction of this didn't work out, So, yeah, I felt this was a great opportunity to look at a love not failed, but a love that didn't run the course of conventional romance.
Totally, yeah. And it again adds to, I think, this sort of unique aspect of this episode, because Indy is always, is trying to pursue somebody in most of the other episodes. And so here, there's a different side of it. And there's a wonderful quote that you wrote in here. You might remember it, but Indy says, love is a weird thing. It's kind of like lightning, and you can no more make it strike than you can stop it if it decides to hit you, which perfectly exemplifies what you were saying there about that bittersweet side of romance. Now, as we discussed earlier, I appreciate the way you instilled fellowship and good spirit in these characters during, the hardships of war and the tense political situation. And in particular, there's a phenomenal scene during Indy's birthday celebration when they decide to cut his cake. It sparks a whole philosophical discussion about different types of ideologies. And at the end, this character, Boris, grabs the cake and says, "This is anarchism in practice," and then, grabs the whole thing. And it's just brilliant. And why did you decide to create this scene? And what do you think is the secret to writing, a memorable scene like this?
This is where I really want to pay tribute to George, in the sense that how often does a writer get encouraged by a producer to say, let's go into some philosophy here, let's go into ideas, and that's what George wanted. As I say, all along there was a steely core of I want people to come out of this knowing more than they did when they went in. So it was within that context that I was able to say, okay, let's explore these issues, because this is what these young people would be doing. The young people did do, hopefully still do today, just argue about the big life, the universe and everything. And then what a great context to do it in, a birthday where you've got celebration, you've got the fact that time is moving forward, you've got a landmark in someone's life, and you've got a cake to argue. So I love discussing ideas. I had the opportunity through George to do just that, instead of somebody saying, well, we can cut this page out because nothing happens. No, he was, this is what I want. And we had a context to create, a context in which to place it. So, it was huge fun to conceptualize. It was huge fun to write. It was huge fun to see how it was realized on screen.
Yeah, and it's a great visual representation of that idea too, easy for, younger people to understand. And in the Verdun episode, which I think was written by Jonathan Hensley, there's a similar scene where they're talking about the causes of World War I with all these food items, which is great too. And in all honesty, I think that Lenin's speech is one of the most powerful scenes in the entire series. I watch it all the time. You created such a well-written speech. It's so forceful and captivating. And we spoke to Simon Windsor a couple years ago about, what it was like to shoot this scene. But from the writing side, how did you approach writing a monologue for such a famous historical figure?
Well, first of all, I did read a lot of his actual speeches, and I also watched watched him giving speeches. Now, it's not the same thing as listening to them, because obviously in those days you didn't have the sound, but I could see him delivering his speeches, so I got the feeling of the rhythm of his speech patterns from archive footage.
Wow!
And I watched that quite a bit. He's very lively. He's physically very lively speaker. And I was also inspired by, the drama of his life. The drama, I love the drama of his return to Russia, which in the sealed train, the fact that he was in exile in Switzerland. And when the Tsar fell, the Germans wanted the Russian government to surrender, essentially. And Kerensky, who had taken over from the Tsar, in Parliament, was not going to surrender. And so the Germans wanted Lenin in Russia to encourage the Russian government to surrender. But how were they going to get him there? He was in Switzerland. In order to get to Russia, he had to travel across territory controlled by the Germans. The Germans did not want him getting the German workers excited by communism. So they put him in a sealed train.
Wow.
And so he wasn't allowed out. Once they travelled in some comfort, but he wasn't allowed out of the train, whenever it stopped at stations in Germany, until he was all the way in Finland. In fact, the train took them not directly into Russia, but into Finland. And from Finland, he went into Russia to the Finland station, where he got off and where the crowds were waiting to greet him. But there's quite a lot of record of what he was saying on the train. People knew he was, after years as an impoverished exile, he was now literally being taken by train into history. This was his moment in history. So people were writing down what he said on the train as they travelled across Europe to his rendezvous with destiny. And so I had that material to work from.
Wow, that is incredible. I mean, it's so historically rich. I mean, you just feel that sense of like forcefulness, I guess, of Lennon and speaking to that massive crowd. Now, during the final scene in this episode, Indy attempts to stop Irina and Sergei from protesting. And, throughout this episode, Indy is given very clear directions that he must work with the utmost diligence to avoid letting the Bolsheviks come to power because he essentially works for, a government that wants the revolution to fail. So, as a result, Indy's friends become quite apprehensive about his loyalty and trust. So with this final scene here, what do you think is important about the theme of friendship in this episode, and how did you try to communicate that to the audience?
The key thing is that clash between your ideals, your patriotic relationships, how you feel about your country, what you're supposed to be doing for your country, and also your relationship with the people who are employing you. And all of these things, I think in everybody's life, they conflict sometimes quite often. There'll be things that you think are the right thing to do, but are going to get you in trouble. The things you think are the wrong thing to do, can you mitigate them? Can you make sure they don't happen in the worst possible way? There are loyalties you have to your friends, there are loyalties you have to your country, and they come into conflict, and it's hard to reconcile them. And I don't think you can make an ironclad rule and say this is always the rule you should follow. I think it was E.M. Forster who once said, if I had the choice between betraying a friend and my country, I hope I would have the guts to betray my country.
Oh, wow.
Now, I don't agree with that, but that, sums up the dilemma that does come up in people's lives sometimes very, very effectively. What is the right thing to do? And that's what I wanted to address in that. And I hope I hope audiences feel the real dilemma that Indy feels.
Oh, totally. It worked out so well, I think, in the end. I mean, it's such a powerful ending. And I think it's fair to say, that this episode has a much more, sophisticated and intellectual tone, again, whether that was intentional or not, which kind of contrasts the comedic aspect of Prague and the Barcelona episodes. Because each episode was a different genre, did your writing process change at all for each screenplay, or were there differences that you sort of remember looking back on it now, doing these 3 separate episodes?
No, not really. That is to say, my emphasis in writing is always the structure of the story, making sure that the story moves along at a pace, has, as I was saying earlier, certain crucial hinge points. Those same criteria applied whether it was comedy or philosophy or drama. No, it's the same process. Essentially, it's the classic thing that the writer has got to do: sit in front of the computer screen and get something down on it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Don't wait. Don't say, "Oh, I must tidy up my paper clips again." So it's getting the words down on the page and then changing them. My writing process is very much to write and revise, not to hang about waiting for inspiration. Which, as a professional writer and as someone who, when I was putting my kids through college, you can't afford to wait for inspiration.
I'm curious to know if you ever watched the completed Young Indy episodes you wrote, and if so, were there any deleted scenes or significant changes in each episode that were different from what you had originally written in your scripts?
Not really, no. I mean, the comedic sensibility of Terry Jones and is a different one from other comedic directors. Simon Windsor, I think, caught Petrograd, St. Petersburg sequence superbly. I mean, Simon is a director I hugely admire for his sort of muscular, direction. He knows how to make an action story really sing. And so to the extent that there were changes to my script, they weren't as much dramatic changes as, oh, that's better than that came off better than I wrote. There's that kind of thing,
Right.
So, I mean, not my main regret, but there was 1 or 2 episodes that were written. I think this applies to all of us on the series, because the series didn't last as long as George wanted it to. There's one particular episode that I wrote that never got made, which I think could have been marvelous. It was about the guy who founded the Red Cross.
Yeah.
And that was very much an idea that came from George. And it was this chap who was involved in the terrible battle in the late 19th century, saw the suffering of the wounded and dying, and set up an organization to bring voluntary help to the battlefield, and became the first president of the Red Cross, but then was brought down by politics and thrown out of the Red Cross and became a tramp. And he was literally a homeless person. And that's where young Indy met him and befriended him and got the whole story of the founding of the Red Cross. And I was very proud of that episode. And I think George liked it as well. ABC, which had given him very much, sort of carte blanche in writing, in creating these episodes, this whole series, and said, look, George said, I want creative control over this, and he had it. But I think the network, at one point it was said to me, the network loved the young Indy episodes where there's lots of explosions, and they're not so fond of the ones where people are discussing ideas. As a result, the show was not put out at the right time slot. I mean, it's a family show. There were times when in the New York market it was going out at 10 o'clock at night.
Wow.
Which is crazy. And so I think the ABC didn't like everything they were getting. They knew it was quality, but they wanted another Indiana Jones adventure, and that was not what it was supposed to be. And so it didn't get the placement on air that it should have, didn't build the audience that it should have, and therefore didn't keep going as long as it should have, because we had there was a lot more fuel there ready to keep young Indy going.
Yeah, and it's a shame because the show is it's so well done. And, I've always looked at it as something separate from the feature films. And as I've gotten into this podcast and done more and more research over the years, you learn, what George Lucas, his vision for this show, it changes the way you watch it and the way you understand it, I think. And as you had mentioned, he had originally planned for young Indy to lead, kind of directly into the feature films. And supposedly he had this sort of timeline detailing around 70 individual stories that were going to be developed into full-length episodes. You talked about one that it sounds like you had a script written for already. Were there any other episodes that were unproduced that you remember workshopping with the writers or that you actually wrote a script for?
I'll be honest with you, it's slipped into the past now. As a writer, one produces, so many scripts that some of which are paid for, some of which are made, and I've forgotten, I'll be honest with you. But I'm sure there were. I mean, it was a really creative team that he put together. It was wonderful to work with those other writers and, people like Jules Selbo and so on, and Rosemary Ann Sissons, people who were, working with Rosemary Ann Sissons, who had written Henry the Six Wives of Henry VIII, and it was fabulous. The combination of characters and personalities that George brought together, levels of experience. I mean, taking a chance on me, who hadn't had anything produced at all, was a wonderful act of generosity and faith by him, for which I'll be forever grateful. And pairing me with writers who had some success and writers who had huge amounts of success, and and then wrangling this team together and keeping us all creative and fired up through the years that we worked on it. A great achievement by a producer. I mean, he is a great man.
No doubt. And I mean, just the amount of talent, whether it was actually in the episodes or behind the camera, was just absolutely phenomenal. And as you reminisce now about the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, nearly 30 years later, what did you take away from the experience, and what impact has the show had on you as a filmmaker and as a person?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I took away many of George's techniques for brainstorming when I was working on my own series, The Secret Adventures of Jules Verne.
Yeah.
That film script that I wrote, I ultimately turned into a 22-episode TV series, which we shot in Canada. And I used those same techniques that George had taught me as to develop stories with other writers. But also, I use that for myself. If I'm coming up with a story myself, I will brainstorm as if there are other people in the room, and George is taking the notes until I've created something. And as I say, part of that brainstorming is coming up with crazy ideas. I write them down in this case, as opposed to there's no one there to take notes, but I write them down, and including the ones that are absolute rubbish. That is part of the key to brainstorming, because it's by saying the ridiculous things that you find your way to the thing that is what you need to find. So that had a huge influence on me creatively in terms of how you do things, how you get your own mind to work as creatively as possible. There was also the sheer ambition and scope of what George did. I mean, only someone with his background and what he had already achieved could do it. But at the same time, it made me ambitious. So, when I was writing things like The Mists of Avalon or War and Peace and so on, or indeed Secret Adventures, I thought big, and I think that helped. As I say, my experience of writing scripts was based on reading a wrongly formatted paperback of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid when I went into this. But by the time I came out of the Young Indy process, I thought, okay, I do know how to do this, rightly or wrongly, but it gave me the confidence to see if I could make an actual living here. And so far, so good. And so that's another good thing that came out of George hiring me on Young Indy.
Well, Mr. Gavin Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today about Young Indiana Jones. This was an incredibly insightful interview. I hope it was enjoyable for you and also all the listeners out there listening. So thank you so much for this, Gavin.
Well, thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it as well. And also, if I may say, if people ever want to know more of the works of Gavin Scott, I've got my website, gavinscott.co, and my books, for example, The Age of Treachery, the spy novels, or my historical novel, The Adventures of Toby Way, are also available on Amazon. So if anyone is interested to follow up, it's possible.
Terrific. Well, that's great to hear. And to all of you listening, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out Gavin's website. Also, make sure to subscribe to our podcast, leave a review, share it with others, tell other people what you think about the show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so on our website, www.theindianajonesuniverse.com. We have a contact page there where you can email us, or you can follow us over on X. You can find us there at The Indy Universe. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Once again, I'm Will.
And I'm Gavin Scott, and until next time, so long, Dr. Jones.